My name is Jose Corpas. I'm the author of Black Ink. It's a story about Panama Al Brown. And I'm very happy to be here with Sissy Gamache. We're going to talk about him, maybe talk about other things too, right, Sissy?
Guys, let's not mind the action. This is a boxing gym. This is Gleason's. And we have a lot of action going on. Fighters going in the speed bag, people going in the ring, sparring sessions. It's a lot of action going on. So I just wanted to bring that to the attention to the audience in case that you guys don't know. But anyway, we're going to have a good time. I'm more than thrilled to have you here. Jose Corpas is one of the few boxing journalists who really know the game. I got to mention Zach. I got to mention Mitch as well from Daily News. There's a lot of young boxing journalists who are creating wonderful stories on the daily basis. Jose Corpas is one of them. He's a gentleman that we met maybe 5-6 years ago. And he said, Sissy, I just wrote a book that I think that we should talk about. And we're going to have a conversation right now. Thrilled to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. Well, this is a wonderful book. Like I said, I was saying before, I almost read it almost to the end. Okay. It's a compelling story. Panama Al Brown. A lot of people who are not in boxing, they don't know who he is. So can we bring that to the attention, explain who he was, so we can know, each one of us?
Sure. Well, right, so he was from Panama. His father was an American slave from Tennessee who went down to Panama to work on the Panama Canal. Then Panama Al Brown got into boxing down there. He went on to become the first Latino to become the world champion. And then his story gets a little deeper because he was also very well known to be a homosexual. And during those days, it was frowned upon. And in New York, a lot of the media and a lot of the commissioners were against him. And when he first won the NBA title, they tried to make it go away. And then he was too good to keep down. He eventually ended up winning universal recognition of the title. And then he lost the title, and according to him, he was drugged for that fight. So it's a story that reaches beyond boxing. You know, he was friends with Josephine Baker. He had a romantic affair with Jean Cocteau, who was a famous French poet, later on writer, who did Les Miserables, not Les Miserables, Beauty and the Beast, Les Enfants Terribles, right? So he crossed a lot of paths. He was friends with Pablo Picasso, right? And at the very end, unfortunately, like too many boxing stories, he died without any money. A lot of his money was lost during the German takeover of France during World War II. And he came here, he became a drug addict, and they found him in the street. And little by little, throughout all these years, his story was forgotten. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to write the book.
Yeah, this is a lot of what I noticed when I was reading it, and I was making my notes, is that you bring a lot of information to the reader. It's a lot. I mean, you pretty much have a story context, correct?
Yes.
How much research is that too?
It took a long time to do it. It took more than 4 years to write it. And a lot of the stories that I heard about him, I couldn't find anywhere in print. So I had to start going to like online libraries of French from Europe, Spain, Panama. And I was able to find enough pieces to be able to tell the story with confidence. There's some things that I couldn't tell because I wasn't able to corroborate it with other sources. But for the most part, I think if you read the book, you could come to your own conclusions. You could see that he was put through a lot unnecessarily. Well, not maybe unfairly. Maybe in his day, it might have been more common. But I mean, it's just a fantastic story. I'll even get into one of the parts in there where he was even attacked by fans after one fight. You know, to the point where he had to be sent to the hospital. So, I mean, there's stuff that's unheard of. We don't even hear about it now, and it's almost like it didn't happen. Right. Mm-hmm.
It was overwhelming, Jose, because like I said, when I was reading it, it really got my attention, the amount of historic information, the Panama, the canal, and all the building, and all the workers, and the slavery, and the prejudice, the amount of prejudice. I mean, a little bit of the background, the mother who brought the 6 children. Am I right? Yeah. She was born in a plantation as well. I mean, the whole beginning is a compelling story. And then when he took the boat, when he came to America, he was peeling potatoes. I mean, it's so overwhelming.
Yeah, you can't tell his story without getting into that. You know, some stories they overlap with racism, they overlap with hate, they overlap with the Great Depression, they overlap with World War II, they overlap with drugs. His is one of them, and his also adds the added story of homophobia, which was, well, it still exists, but it was much worse then, especially in boxing. So it was. I mean, if you're going to tell his story the right way, you have to tell all of that. And it was very hard to leave certain things out because they affected him and they affected the way people treated him.
Do you have to do a lot of selection with the amount of events and facts? How do you select the work to say, okay, I'm going to include this in my book, that I'm going to leave it out? How does it work for you?
Well, the main thing is I decided instead of writing this book like a newspaper, I decided to write the book like a story. And I decided to tell it like a story, and I try to paint the pictures. So if you read the book, it almost feels like you're watching a movie, right? So some parts, if it didn't flow with the movement of the story, I would leave out. And also some things I left out where I wasn't able to confirm with second or third sources. So there was a lot of extra stuff that I could have got into. You know, he was friends with a lot of other people that I could have gotten into, but the main thing was, it's very easy in his story to get sidetracked. I had to keep bringing it back to Panama Al Brown, and ultimately, it's a boxing story, so I had to keep coming back to boxing. So that was how I did it. It's as long as it didn't take you too far away from the story. That's how I decided what to use and what not to use.
Now, why do we, regular people, we don't know much about him? What do you think that's the reason why?
Don't know much about him?
Yes.
Well, a lot of ugly things were done to him, and I think that a lot of people tried to brush it under the table. And now I just happen to be in the right place at the right time. You know, I started getting into boxing in the 80s. My father knew his story. Almost all the guys in the neighborhood knew his story. And then I was able to meet some of the guys that actually trained with him, like Pedro Montañez, right? And just in conversations, I heard bits and pieces. But when you got a bunch of Latino fans talking about boxing, Panama Al Brown's name always came up, right? Because he was the first. And he had such a great style. You know, you should really watch him on YouTube. And, but so many people are dying off, and his story is dying with them. And I never really thought about writing his story, but then just something overcame me, and I felt like I needed to do it. Mm-hmm.
Now, I was reading and making a note that back in the day, it was fewer classes.
Yeah.
So as a result, it was harder for a boxer to get to the top, right? That was basically the time.
There were about every 10 pounds, maybe, there was a new division. Now it's like every 4 pounds. So it's more than double now. Now there's 17, 18 in some amateur and female programs. So now it's 17 divisions. Where he fought, it was predominantly 8. There might have been as many as 12. But the highly sought-after title were the original 8, the flyweight, bantamweight, featherweight, welterweight. Also, there was only one really recognized champion. Now, like today, you have a lot. You have the WBA, you got the IBF, the WBC. There's many. Back then, it was a little bit fractured. You had the New York State Athletic Commission and the NBA, National Boxing Association, which later became the WBA right now. But they usually recognize the same person. And a lot of times, those guys fought each other. So for the most part, you had one champion throughout those, one champion in 8 divisions for the majority of the time, in his time especially.
What was the most compelling thing about his story? What's the stuff that grabbed your heart and guts and say, I'm going to write about this man, about this fighter? What was the most compelling factor in his life, in your opinion?
The fact that the whole story is almost unknown, and his whole story went away. I mean, people know he was champ, and that's about where it stands. So I think that was very compelling. I think that there obviously was a movement and an effort to keep him away from the title, and they even kept him out of the press, and they succeeded because for so many years, I mean, it's been 80 years, and some people still don't know what really happened back then, and they don't, you know, the truth is ugly sometimes, and people try to hide it. And I'm not saying I'm a fan of his. I'm not judging anybody. I'm just telling what happened, right? And what happened was that his story was pretty much vanished. And I think that's pretty fascinating because almost all other old champions, you know their stories for the most part, not his. So that's was what I thought was the most compelling thing about him.
What about the day that he came to New York City?
When he came the first time, I think it's kind of crazy. You know, he came without an address. He came without a place to stay. He got on the boat as a stowaway, right? He gave a different name. He got in. They started working on
Peeling potatoes.
peeling potatoes. Yeah, and then he came to New York, and he didn't have money for car fare or taxi, train, nothing. So he walked from downtown up to Harlem, right? He came in June 1923. And for the first few days, he didn't have anywhere to go, anywhere to stay, so he was homeless. He was sleeping in the streets. He couldn't find a gym, and then by luck, he bumped into an old boxing stablemate from Panama, right, from the Strand Gym in Cologne, named Bobby Risdo, who told him, you know, just out of luck, they just met each other, and he brought him over to the gym with where he met Leo P. Flynn, and Leo P. Flynn started managing him, and they started boxing.
Incredible, right?
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, it's especially now at a time when we don't even leave our house without a cell phone, right? And he's going out to a different country with no address, nothing. Just all he wanted to do was find Kid Norfolk, the boxer. I just got to find Kid Norfolk. Someone's got to know him. And it took about 2-3 weeks maybe, and eventually he did find it though.
The skills about the fighter. First time when he came to the gym, what did they say? What history says about his ability as a fighter?
Oh, he's going to rate high. You know, it's hard to say who's better than who, but he was definitely one of the better ones in his division and in his time. He definitely was very skillful. Fought a little bit like Muhammad Ali or Willie Pep on his feet, moving a lot. Had a big right hand. Later on, he started relying more on the left hook because he kept hurting his right hand. I think he's a great fighter. I tell everyone who's watching this just to pull him up on YouTube. There's a few highlights of him. There's no full fights, but there's a few highlights of him, and you get a real idea. He was very almost acrobatic, like a ballet dancer almost in the ring. Mm-hmm.
Coordination. My father used to say that he had a big amount of coordination.
He did. Your father's right. He was a tap dancer outside of the ring also. He also did some of the other dances that were down there, like the Lindsay Bop and all those dances, the Charleston. And a lot of times in the ring, he looked like he was dancing. Yeah, he was very coordinated. Mm-hmm. Very modern, very modern style of fighting.
Somebody just crossed in front of the camera. I love it. This is Glison's gym, like we said it.
It's a real gym, yeah.
It's a real gym. It's a real action. It's no extras. Whatever you guys hear behind us is happening. So that's the gym. Now, what happened when he went to Europe? He started going to France and making good money.
Yeah, well, what happened was in New York, they weren't giving him any chances to do anything else, right? So he went to Europe, and he had like mixed feelings about going to Europe. But when one of his friends was light heavyweight boxing champion Battling Sissy, right? And Battling Sissy, if you know his story, he was found murdered, right? And a lot of rumors were that the police did it. Right, so there was a lot of reasons for him to want to leave America also. Also, his father was from America. He was a former slave, right? He was a slave until he was a little kid, and then they had all the lynchings that his father witnessed, right? So, or maybe not witnessed, but what lived around, right? It was all around him. So the racism was very heavy for him, and he heard those stories. So when the opportunity came to go to Paris, he took it because a lot of artists were going to Paris over there, right? A lot of musicians, a lot of poets, Josephine Baker, Langston Hughes, a lot of them were going over there, and he was one of them. And in France, they also had their share of prejudice, but it wasn't the same type. And if you were a performer, you were still able to get more opportunities. And the opportunities that he got over there compared to opportunities in New York was a no-brainer. So he went to New York, and he became a big star right away because of his boxing style. But then he started meeting almost with the same homophobic race. So there was a group that loved him, and then there was a group that didn't like him. And they were to the point where they would like spit on him. Some people said they would throw bananas at him, and they even attacked him in the ring when he came out of one of his fights. So it was mixed feelings, but he had much more success over there. And since there was a demand for American fighters over there, he was one of the few. So he was a lot more popular over there and made a lot more money in Europe than he was in the United States.
I was reading, but it's incredible when you see the journey that he was making $5 per week, peeling potatoes. It's incredible.
That money. He never collected that money.
And he never collected that money. When you see the struggle, the determination when he was walking and he didn't have any money, any job, any connections, no home, made it to the top. That's not an easy thing, right?
No, it's never an easy thing to become champion, but it just seems like he just had a few extra obstacles, right? But yeah, it was just an incredible journey. Yeah.
What about the New York Commission back then? The commission, the Athletic Commission of Boxing.
You know, if you read the European newspapers, like the Spanish newspaper in particular, they really seem to be anti-Al Brown, right? And there's a couple of writers in there that I document in the book that documented exactly how they treated him, and they didn't want him to be champ, it looks like. It really looks that way. It's hard to get in someone's head and say what they were feeling, but it looks that way, and they never gave any other reason. So the New York Commission and even Tex Rickard never put him on in the main event, Madison Square Garden, after the Kid Francis fight. So, yeah, I guess they really didn't want anything to do with him. Mm-hmm.
It was really hard to give him credit. He deserved the credit, but it was really hard for him to get it.
No, he wasn't. It didn't come easy, that's for sure, no. Mm-hmm.
Okay, but I'm trying to cover as much as I can because you're flying with the answers. You are so loaded with the topic. For how long you been studying Panama Brown?
It took, well, you know.
How many years?
Well, remember, back when I was a kid, I heard about him, so I was almost learning about him without even realizing it, right? And then when I actually sat down and decided to write the book, I actually wanted to write a book about the history of boxing in Latin America, right? So I was getting into the way it started in Argentina and Chile. And then when I came up to Al Brown, then I started, he was the first champion, so I was going to dedicate just a chapter for him. And then I started looking at what was online, and I started saying, wait a minute, this is not the story I heard. So I just had to start going and looking for it. And then I realized that a lot of people didn't know what really happened to him. So that's when I decided, you know what, a chapter turned into a whole book. And that took a little bit more than 4 years to actually do all of that.
Really, that long?
Yeah, because I had to get, well, you know, up in Harlem, the Schomburg Research Center, you could get a lot of resources. So I was able to find a lot of Panamanian newspapers. And online, you could get a lot of digital archives. So I was able to get a lot of French newspapers and a lot of newspapers from Spain and Italy and England. So, it took a while to read all that. And then when I read about, his relationship with Jean Cocteau, I did a little bit of research on Jean Cocteau, right? When I heard about, World War II coming, I did a little research on World War II. Then when I heard some of his opponents, like Kid Francis and Young Perez, who were detained by Nazis and killed in concentration camps, I did a little research on them. So, I did a little research on how they built the Panama Canal. So it just kept branching into a little bit of something extra else.
It is great, Jose, because you're giving an entire context to the story. You're bringing not only his work and his past and his relationship to the boxing world back then, in the amount of prejudice that he had to face, right? But you're bringing all the background, his mother, the plantations, Panama, the injustice, the social injustice that even to this day we're living. I mean, this book brings so much awareness to what's going on, because what's scary is that a lot of the things that you read over here, they're still happening now.
Yeah, that's true, and that's the second time someone's told me that too. Yeah, it is. That it could be scary. Just, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's scary, the amount of prejudice, and how compelling for a journalist, from a journalist's point of view, is to have, to read about a fighter who fought with an empty stomach.
I mean, doing anything on an empty stomach is not easy. So just imagine, fighting. It's, I mean, it happens in the world today. There's still people starving in the world today, right? So in a lot of ways, his story is not so extraordinary compared to other stories. There are a bunch of Panama Browns out there. But when you add in some of the extra stuff like poverty, racism, homophobia, boxing, now there's a lot of texture to his story. It makes it even more fascinating that he was so forgotten and overlooked.
He got into drugs, heavy drinking, getting drunk after the fights, getting in fights. I mean, Why? What do you think had happened to him?
I don't know, but there were a lot of Spanish newspapers that and interviews where they actually described him as being in a suicidal state right around the time of 1932 or 33. So there was a lot of stuff going on with him with his when his mother died, and there was a lot of regret that he felt because he didn't. It looks like on some sides it looks like he tried to send some money occasionally, but then there's other sides that say he really didn't or not as much as he could have. So there was a lot of regret with that, and he didn't get to see her much towards the end. And he didn't want her because he got syphilis, right? And when he got syphilis, he started breaking out in these open chancre sores, right?
Even back then, they didn't have what we have now.
Penicillin back then, yeah, you had to rub mercury ointment or sweat it out. So he didn't want his mother to see him that way, right? So a lot of times he didn't go for that reason. So then his mother died, and when he found out that she was, basically sweeping floors to make a living, there was a lot of guilt on him. The homophobia also had to do something. You still see today, you read about people on Facebook when they get outed and someone says they're homophobia and they're jumping off bridges or killing themselves, right? So that's something that could have contributed to it. On the one side, you look at him and you say, wow, this guy traveled the whole world. Paris, Belgium, France, Spain, Morocco, right? At the same time, he's a man without a home at the same time, right? He's a nomad. So a lot of that stuff had to contribute to it. And plus he got into drugs. And when you get into drugs, you almost lose control of what you're doing. So, he was, he wasn't himself anymore
He was fighting with his own demons as well, not only the fighters.
Yeah, it seems that way. And if you read the book,
He's coming to that ring, but he's bringing all that past. He's bringing all that struggle, the hunger, the prejudice. It was pretty heavy.
Yeah, and like I said, there's a lot of reports that said that it looked like he was in a suicidal state for a good portion of his championship reign. And we see that, I don't want to say suicidal, but, suicidal. Adrian Broner recently said he was suicidal. Some people say it's just for media attention. Who knows? You can't take it seriously. But look at Tyson Fury, who just gave up all his belts at heavyweight because of depression. It's very hard because depression is real, but you can't see it. So it's very hard to deal with something that you can't see. And Panama Brown, by all accounts, was an alcoholic, a drug addict, was with syphilis and also battling depression.
A misfit.
Yes, it's a lot. Never mind your opponent. You already had half a battle right in there. Mm-hmm.
Right. It was very interesting when I was reading about Josephine Baker and the Moulin Rouge. She used to go to that club, it's the gay club in Paris. Yes. I mean, it's interesting to read about it because you can see it in the movie.
Yeah, and I read a lot of things that I didn't really wish I read, right? So I kept that out of the book. But yeah, he went. That was his scene, and he was going there. He was one of the regulars there. He's very well known. A lot of times they invited him on stage, sing and dance. He used to play a lot of instruments too. Was a decent sax player. So he, it was part of his routine. He was going to all those clubs, yeah.
It would be interesting for you, honestly, and I'm just giving you the idea. You do whatever you want. This is your book. But Woody Allen would do something great with this.
Yeah, I think he would. Yeah, I think he would, and I wish I could.
I will approach. I mean, I don't know. This is your book, and I think this is the greatest. I told you when I was reading it, it's a great book for a movie. This is a movie. But Woody Allen would be like just so amazing because he can bring all that sense of humor and humanity to the story. Because boxing is always related. Boxing are sad stories, Jose. Am I right? I mean, it's always tragedy and drama and struggle. But it would be interesting to see boxing a little bit under a different light. And I feel that all the context and all the events that you have here, it will be a great cocktail for Woody Allen to make a great movie.
Yeah, I agree. And not just Woody Allen, I think other people would. Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew how to get it to him so he could read it though. But yeah, definitely there is enough in there for a movie. They've made movies about people who had a less interesting life. So sure, you could definitely make a movie about his life, absolutely.
What was the writing process for you when you were putting all the ideas together? It was frustrating, it was easy, it was difficult. How was the process for you? as a writer, from the writer point of view?
Well, it's a little more, it was very frustrating because when you're writing about someone's life, you have a lot more responsibility to get it right, right? You have a lot more responsibility to be as accurate as possible. And when I'm telling his story, I'm not really like a fan of Panama Brown. I don't have his picture hanging on my wall or anything. I'm a fan of his equally as all the other great champions. Baby Arizmendi, Kid Chocolate, Sixto Escobar. He's not any different from them other than the fact that he was the first Latino champion. So he was very frustrating because a lot of the sources that I had were in a different language, right? And even though I'm fluent in Spanish, my reading level is probably like 7th or 8th grade in Spanish, right? So I'm reading words that I don't understand. Then I had to read French. I learned French in school, maybe 1 or 2 years. That was not enough, so I had to like get translating, and I would put it like on the internet, like on Bing. I'd copy and paste like a whole paragraph and then paste it. So it was very difficult for that, and it was very frustrating. And I got tired of the book a few times, and a few times I felt like stopping. But I reached a point where it just felt like his ghost was there telling me, his spirit was like, hey, you got to finish it. I went so far, I had to finish it. And I got tired of the story, though, so it was a very tiring experience. I don't think I would do it again unless I knew the guy, like if like Kid Chocolate over there, right? If he wants to tell me the story, maybe I could do it. But yeah, exactly. But I'm not, I'm not looking forward to it again, though. Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of work.
It is.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. And like you said, when it's a true story, you have more responsibility. You want to certainly bring it to the action and say, wait a minute, I have all this work and all these events. When I was reading it, Jose, it was a little bit overwhelming, the amount of facts. I mean, it was like, oh my God, how do they, it's a lot of information. And for people who are not related to boxing, there's a lot of names that we don't know. So it's challenging for the reader as well.
Yeah, and it was challenging for me in a lot of ways because I'm writing about an era that I'm not from, right? I'm writing from the 1920s, 1930s. So I came across a lot of names that I didn't know. Now, I knew some of the big names, right? Some of his big opponents, but a lot of his European opponents I didn't know because here in the United States, they didn't really write about them as much. So I had to learn about a lot of fighters out there, and I learned that they had a very nice boxing scene down there, too, in Europe. And I had to learn a lot about a lot of the fighters and a lot of the promoters there. So it was very difficult for me also in that sense because I had to keep stopping and then getting sidetracked. But, he was a boxer, and we have to talk about boxing. And when you box, you fight a lot of opponents. And he had, 160 fights. So that's a lot of opponents you got to talk to. Because even if you want to talk about a third of his opponents, you're still talking about 50 fighters. So that's a lot of research had to be done, especially when he fought against guys that were so interesting, right? When he fought even guys like, okay, we know about Young Perez that I mentioned him before and Kid Francis, but even guys like Carlos Flix from Spain that was against the wrong side of the revolution there when Franco was taking over in Spain, right? And Carlos Flix was also a victim of all of that, and there was a lot of fighters that were victimized from that. So you start learning how certain careers, and if you go in history, you see how certain careers ended almost at the same time. And then you start realizing that there was a lot of political reasons. So it was interesting, but also frustrating at the same time.
Right. What would be his legacy? His legacy as a fighter, his legacy as a man who fought and he went through struggle. What would be his legacy in your opinion?
Well, you can't ever take away from him that he was the first Latino champion, right? And as far as legacy, I think his legacy is what it is. He's one of the best bantamweight champions in the world, right? But there was a little bit more to his story. And he might have been the first homosexual champion also. He might have been, at least under the Marquess of Queensberry, right? So he's got a few legacies there. And he should be remembered for someone who persevered through all of that.
How the boxing world see him? Professional fighters, people in the game, how do they see Panama Brown?
There's still a lot of the homophobia. You could go into boxing.com. They did a book review on it by Adam Berlin, right? And you still see a few of the people there have some sort of homophobic reaction. I had, I was going at his Wikipedia page just a few months ago, like November 2015. Homophobic comments on there also. So these are people who never met him. Nobody alive today met him. I doubt it. Maybe Jake LaMotta. I don't even know if they met, but he was probably, I mean, you'd have to be about 88 years old minimum to have met him, right? Still be around at least. He died in 1951, right? So to remember him anyway, you'd have to have been born sick. Well, there might be a few, but there's not too many left, right? So most likely these are people that didn't know him and they don't like him. And they talk about the homophobia. So if you're talking about 60 years after he died, you still feel it. Just imagine how it was when he was alive, right? You know, I heard people didn't want to use the bathroom after he used it, right?
Right, yeah, I remember that.
Some of that was because he had syphilis, not just because he was homosexual. But, I mean, it's very hard to put yourself, it's kind of hard to imagine what it was that he was going through.
What do you learn from him with this book?
What did I learn?
Yeah.
I learned a lot. I learned a lot about stuff that didn't have to do with politics. I learned how boxing started out in Panama, right? It started out as entertainment for the builders of the Panama Canal. And they had a really good boxing scene. There were some really good fighters going down there, like Ken Norfolk, Sam Langford, Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh. They had a...
Roberto Mano Piedra Duran, we know. But yes.
Yeah, it was...
I'm a big fan, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was real deep and down there, and they had a real rich thing, rich history. World War I broke out, so a lot of people left. A lot of the Navy and the Army left. So it kind of dwindled a little bit, and then it turned into like a local fighter against a serviceman. That I didn't know how rich the history in boxing was in Panama. I didn't know it went that far back, right? So that was one thing I learned. And then it fades in the middle. Right after Al Brown, it kind of fades, and you start finding out that those countries started going through like World War II, and then they had their own little civil wars, right, going out throughout their country. So you almost see in Latin America, Colombia, Panama, you almost see a dead spot from 1940 to 1960, because they were...
Boxing was banned. Boxing was completely forbidden.
In some areas it was forbidden. In some areas there was just too much political conflicts going on. So no one had time to box in that time. The fans weren't supporting it. It wasn't that big. Then it takes up. And so it explains why you see a lot of gaps in the histories. And then when boxing started taking off in the 60s, that's when you see the WBC was formed and took it off.
What about the book on the history of boxing in Latin America? What do you think? Are you going to go back to that? Are you going to start writing about it?
It's, you know, it's like a...
You need a little break because you're exhausted. So after 4 years, I forget it, Sissy. I need a break. No more boxing for the next 25 years.
No, I just got...
I'm kidding.
I just got tired of him for the time being, right? Yeah, may he rest in peace. But no, I'm going to finish it. It's about 25% done. And there's a lot of info in there. There's what I did for Panama Brown, I could do for about 15 other guys. Not an entire book, but you know, there's a lot of fascinating stories out there. The original Kid Pambele, for example, from Nicaragua. There's a bunch of guys that we could talk about. And I have it all here, so I might as well finish it. I don't know when I'm going to get around to doing it, but I will. Mm-hmm.
Right, so a final thought about the book, man. This is your life. This is your first book. Second book. What's the first one?
The New York City's Greatest Boxers.
Oh, man, I got to read that one. I haven't read it. So you're going to go to the third one. You're going to keep writing. And you're going to bring this to a film.
I don't know who to take it to, but I would love for them to look at it. Yes, I think there's enough in there to make a movie.
Anybody in your head? Let's be wild. Let's be crazy. Any actor? Who will be perfect for this guy? Panama Brown.
Yeah, there's a lot. The one guy that I'm thinking in my head is the guy who played Everybody Loves Chris. I think he could.
I don't know him.
I don't know his name either. I just know there's a few guys. I think Spike Lee would like the movie, for example. There's a few people in there that I think could really do something with it. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the reason we're bringing more attention to it. I love the book. Like I said, I'm not an expert. I'm not a boxing expert, and there were a few names there that I have no idea who they were. But I had a good time. I made my notes, and it's a lot of heart and a lot of head. You put a lot of effort to this. It's a labor of love.
Well, I didn't love it all. I just felt that it was a responsibility, and I had to do it right. I felt I had to do all of that. And if anyone ever writes a story about you, me, or anybody else, I hope that they are responsible with the information too.
You even capture not only the facts, you brought the soul to it. His soul.
Okay. Yeah, someone told me that. Yeah, someone told me I breathed life into him. Good. I'm glad they felt that way. I'm glad that they felt like they got to meet him. I don't claim to know him. Only I know secondhand information. I know people that didn't know him, so I know a little bit about him. But if you say that I touched his soul, then yeah, I think that means I did the book well then. So I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you.